Yes. So I'd like to talk today about the economy that you can obtain driving an RV and maybe the philosophies behind it. Of course, there are of that, but for a given vehicle, there are things we can do to make a difference. Time has passed now that almost all vehicles are going to be fuel injected. The difference is that the newer vehicles have transmissions with 5 or 6 gears in them instead of perhaps the classical 4. So you can use those constraints with respect to how you drive your vehicle. Of course, it can also be diesel or gas as well. I found in analyzing my own vehicle that when you get into stop and go traffic, that your mileage factors will increase by 30 to 40%. So if you're getting, uh, let's say 7 or 8 or 6 whatever miles per gallon, you might be down around 4 or 5. So you want to avoid a stop and go environment as much as you can with your big vehicle. And of course, I'm talking about, in my case, a Class A 35-foot with the Ford V10 416 horsepower engine and a R100 transmission, 4-speed automatic. So what I've found in my travels is that for the most part, I try to drive on open roads. So those being the 400 series highways in Ontario or in the United States on the interstate highways for the most part. If you get onto a lot of U.S. highways, there's a substantial number of stoplights, and this can drastically affect your mileage, especially if you're towing a vehicle, because you have to accelerate all of this mass every time you start your vehicle, every time you stop it. All that gasoline is just going up in the heat in the braking system. So by planning your route a little bit, you might be able to avoid some of this. In addition, and I think this is one where the RV GPSs maybe could do a little better, is that hills, of course, substantial hills can be a very substantial pull on the fuel mileage. They can cut it in half or worse, depending how steep the hill is. So if we're in a situation where you would be going across an undulating terrain of non-trivially steep hills, you might find it better to drive some significant distance further and go around it. I have talked to people who, for example, going from Canada to Florida, won't take I-75. They'll take, I believe it's I-66 through Ohio, and you miss almost all the mountains. And it's an argument about driving further, but you can argue that you're going to be going a bit faster and also with a lot less wear and tear. And that's maybe something that I want to say too. RVs, of course, are for fun, but they're complicated vehicles and they're expensive to prepare and maintain. And so I never quite understand when I see people driving down the highway with an RV at high speeds. Maybe the big diesels are built for it, and that's okay. But I think when I see people going down the road with a 25, 30-year-old RV and they're smoking it at 65 miles an hour or whatever, all you're doing is just courting trouble. And whether it's a breakdown on the trip or whatever, I think that, as I like to say, we drive these things like librarians, and they ride majestically along. And I think that the acceleration and all the other things that you do it gently and with a forethought. Look ahead and see what's going on. Leave a lot of space, if you can, between you and vehicles ahead of you, so you have time to react, remembering that these vehicles stop in a longer distance than a car does. Have your engine tuned. Keep your maintenance on your car up, on your RV up, the changing of the oil when it's appropriate. Make sure that your mechanic will check the belts and the spark plugs and the air filter and things of that character. A lot of these would be quasi-accessible to a normal person if you had a car, but because they're in the RV and with the engine in the doghouse, it's much more difficult to get to it, so generally we let the mechanics do those things. Everything helps here in this situation. Now, I'm able to get, with the RV that we have, I'm averaging about 3.5 kilometers per liter. If we were to look at this another way, it's about 28.5 liters per 100 kilometers. Now, if we convert this to American gallons per mile, then you're looking at about 8.3. Now, this is, of course, on reasonably level terrain, towing the Jeep and driving around 50 to 52 miles an hour, something in that neighborhood. If we have a massive headwind or something like that, that can, of course, affect it. A tailwind will help it a little bit. I think wind is probably 10% at most in some situations. And we can, of course, look for that and see if there's a system coming, and if there's high wind, maybe you wait a day, or you can perhaps consider going some other direction. The bigger vehicles don't move as much when you're passed by transport trucks and so on, so it seems to be going pretty well. Finally, I also have a fair amount of instrumentation to monitor the performance of the vehicle. One of the things I use is an ultra gauge. It has a number of parameters on it indicating different systems in the engine. I also have a scan gauge 2. The scan gauge 2 gives me properties that I can't get from the ultra gauge. It's like cylinder head temperatures and transmission fluid temperatures and so forth. And those are things I look at in case my vehicle is maybe leading towards some kind of a failure. I'm used to what those temperatures are in different circumstances. And when they get out of range, I know there's a problem. And these instruments, of course, they connect to the OBD2 sensor beneath the steering wheel. And in my case, I put a Y connector on there, and I run 2 of them, like I said. And so far, that's not been any problem. They both seem to operate as they always have. And so you can drive down the road and see how the vehicle is operating, as well as maintaining, your route planning and so forth. I like to do the route planning in advance. I like to start off with a full tank. I know some people like to run light and save a bit of weight, and there's something to be said for that. And we might run lighter with respect to our water and so on, but I find that if you're stopping, let's say you go 800, 900 kilometers, we can do that in one tank with my RV. If you start off and you're going to stop 3 times in the day to save the weight, I would argue that probably pulling into the tank station and all the rest of it is going to cost you almost as much as you're saving, not to mention the time that you're going to be giving up on that. Now, if you're going 800 kilometers and we're driving, let's do it, or say 500 miles, you're looking at a 10-hour driving day, and then you start messing around, you're looking at another couple of hours, and that makes it a long day. So my idea is, if we're going somewhere, we're going to go there. That's the day, is we make the trip, we plan it, and then we execute that. When we cross the border from Canada to the United States, we can take processed foods with us, but we cannot take some of the fresher foods, and it's always a bit iffy whether you can take milk or meat and so on. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't, and all the rest of it. And you have to watch for that, because those restrictions can be placed on that very quickly. So what we generally do is just don't. And if we're going to the Carolinas or whatever, we're going to drive for 2 days, and we're not going to shop. We'll be getting gas, and in the gas station we'll pick up a quart of milk or whatever we need, and and that'll get us through breakfast and our lunches and so on, until we get where we're headed, and we get dug in there. Then we get in the car and we go to a department store, food store, and flesh out what we need in the sense of vegetables and meats and so forth. So that also saves you a bit of gas and time, because you're not messing around in a food store for an hour and a half trying to figure out how to park the RV, because some malls have a lot of islands in them to keep large vehicles out. So these are all things, but wonderfully, Google Street View really helps you For example, with gas stations, do the pumps go in the right direction and things like that, so that you know when you get there that you can deal with it. And of course, RV friendly gas stations like Pilot and especially Flying J with their RV lanes and so on are wonderful. And those are things that we want to take advantage of as much as we can. But by running with full tanks, we're looking at it's got pretty long legs, 500-600 miles sometimes. I've almost gone 1,000 kilometers. I think the record was 960 before I finally filled up. I don't normally let the vehicle get too low. Remember that your generator doesn't run below a quarter of a tank, plus or minus. So when I'm down around a half, I'm starting to think about what we should be doing. And of course, I try to plan all this in advance. And finally, when I'm traveling locally, I maybe don't plan quite the same because I've done those trips many times. But if we're going on a longer run, whether it's, say, to the East Coast or out west or down into the United States, then I'm going to plan the trip to be more efficient, because usually you're away for, say, 2 weeks or something like that, and those are valuable days. We don't get all that much holiday time usually when we're still working. And so to make mistakes when you're planning that mean that you get somewhere really late, or there's some other happenstance, or you have to hurry, or whatever, there's different things that make it, even if the costs aren't significant, it makes it less fun. And so I think having the plan in place and executing the plan and driving the RV as economically as you can, I think that's a good challenge for the driver. I think the driver, operating the vehicle in an economically respectful way will save you money in lots of ways, not only just in straight gasoline and so forth, but also in maintenance and other issues that you don't have to continually fix. And at the same time, it gives you an intellectual challenge when you're driving down, big highways where there isn't all that much to see in some places as you go. Another thing that you might consider doing is, when you get to complicated interchanges, is to take a screenshot of that with your Google Maps and print it out, and then take a pen or a marker and actually mark out the actual ramp that you're supposed to take and what you're looking for. And I think between knowing roughly what's coming and also what signs you need to be looking for in the sense of north, south, or whatever, I think it takes the stress off of some of these things, because, again, you're not in a car. You're in a big, long, in our case, 51, 52 feet long RV and towed vehicle assembly. To stop it and you're in the way of people, you maybe have to unhitch or whatever. This can create all kinds of troubles, and it can be very upsetting at the time. Now, obviously, we don't create problems if we do make a mistake. You just go on the wrong road until you can turn around. But the point is that all this creates stress. So when you're coming in, you're going into these things, you're not enjoying it the way you could be. I'll give you an example. Last summer, my sister and I were traveling, and we came across the Mississippi into St. Louis, and we were heading south on I-44 after St. Louis. So we had to cross the bridge, and then the exits were right on the other side of the bridge before the city begins. So it's pretty tricky, and there's lots of roads going this way and that. And when we got there was construction to go with it. So it was really nice to have two people watching, knowing roughly what we were supposed to be doing anyway. And so we could adapt to the construction. And at the same time, my sister made a nice video of us crossing the river and the beautiful St. Louis skyline and all the rest of it as I drove the RV in and around. So we made a really nice little run there that maybe would have been difficult otherwise. So those are some thoughts about the philosophy behind how you might want to consider driving your vehicle. And again, the main point is we don't want the RVs to be in the shop or even in our own garage with us working on them. We want them to be out doing their stuff. And if we're working on them, it's putting Preventer into the RV so we can go somewhere and have a good time with it. So by being responsible about how we operate them in as many ways as we can be, and just being careful how we operate the controls and the switches. And if we are getting frustrated, just take a step back and don't force something, because like I say, some of these things, and again, an older RV, circuit boards and other things, sometimes are hard to find, and if you you make a mistake, you could have made a really big one. So we need to be very careful about those types of things. Thanks for listening.